We're going to talk about reference test types. And also included some outside videos that are in the public domain so I can comfortably, safely use them without worrying about content. But that doesn't matter to you. Okay, so reference test types. So one way to derive meaning from a test score is to evaluate the test score in relation to other scores on the same test. As I've pointed out, this approach is called norm referenced. But there are other ways to look at a test score to evaluate it on the basis of whether or not some criterion has been met. In my class, I use criterion-based grading, where I've developed a standard on which all judgment and decisions are based. So criterion reference testing and assessment does this exactly, where you essentially develop a method and a standardized procedure for deriving meaning from test scores by evaluating an individual's reference score with reference to a set standard. So, types of tests. We've already talked about a norm reference test, and the other two types are almost used interchangeably in terms of their language. But we're going to talk about criterion reference test, in which the content area is mapped and scores reflect whether a particular standard or criterion has been achieved. Versus domain reference test, which is an assessment that covers a specific area of study, such that a score reveals how much of that area has been mastered. So these criterion for these criterion reference assessments typically are derived from the values or standards of an individual organization. So I'm going to use an example outside of education context because I'm kind of tired of those. So in order to earn a black belt in karate, a student must demonstrate a black belt level of proficiency in karate and meet related criteria such as self-discipline and focus. So each student is evaluated individually to see if all of these criteria are met. And so regardless of the test performance of all the other test takers, only the students who meet the criteria will leave the dojo. I don't know why I put, for those of you unfamiliar, that's the training school, the room, with a brand new black belt. So if everybody does well, everybody gets a black belt. If nobody does well, nobody gets a black belt. There's no curve, there's no adjustment there. If you don't meet the standard, you don't meet the standard. So no belt for you. Norm reference test, just to reiterate, because these are super important too. These classify examinees from low to high. They use a representative sample of individuals, and the items are chosen to produce the maximal discrimination, the maximum ability to identify, to distinguish between those who know the material and those that don't. Typically for test questions, this means about 50% of people will get a question right versus wrong, because that distinguishes the halfway point. That's the idea. But let's talk more about criterion reference testing, because it's what this module and video is about. So these are used to compare accomplishments to a set performance standard. I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm repeating myself because this is a really important concept. And the content is selected based on the relevance to the curriculum. So these testing methods, they do go by other names, but because of the focus on criterion reference approach, that's often how it's referred. So criterion reference versus domain reference, really closely related, but not exactly. But you will hear people use them as synonyms. But let's back up to that contrast between norm reference and criterion reference. So one really good way to conceptualize this difference is how they approach assessment, and it has to do with the area of focus regarding test results. So in norm reference testing, the area of focus is how an individual performed relative to other people who took the test, while in criterion reference testing, we focus on the test taker's actual performance. So what a test taker can and cannot do, and what the test taker has and hasn't learned. and whether or not that test taker has met pre-specified criteria for inclusion. Depending on what the goal of the criteria test is, it could be job admissions, it could be letter grade. So because criterion reference tests are frequently used to gauge achievement or mastery, they are sometimes referred to as mastery tests. Now, the criterion reference approach has enjoyed widespread acceptance in various fields. Yeah, and there's been an increased usage of these kinds of tests for high school graduation as a criteria. Okay, let's talk more about domain referenced. And as a reminder, domain referenced is an assessment that covers a specific area of study, and that your score in that area will tell you how much of that area is mastered. So domain reference assessment it's similar to criterion reference testing. So, but here, if an individual gets 90% of the items right in a domain reference test or a criterion reference test, this would be a high score. It indicates that they have deep knowledge of the content covered on the test. So a 90% is good in this case. And it doesn't matter how other people did. That's the key distinction here. Versus norm reference tests, which requires that you have context of how other people performed. Now you can obviously fuse these together and create criteria based on what you expect for your norm sample, so that if your sample changes over time, you still have a standard to look at. Criterion reference testing still has you use context. You need to know about the test, you need to know what it means. So it's not like contextless, but it doesn't depend on other people's performance. Just to kind of re-articulate what I babbled about there. So these terms are not mutually exclusive. And the use of one approach with a set of test data doesn't preclude the use of the other approach in another application. Because in a sense, all testing is ultimately normative, even if the scores as seemingly criterion references pass-fail. And this is because even in a pass-fail system, there's an inherent acknowledgement of a continuum of abilities. And at some point in the continuum, you have to dichotomize. In this case, you have to make a decision and develop a cut point. So for the rest of this video, I've embedded a video from the Department of Defense that is public domain, so I can include it without risking getting sued. I'm not just using it because it's in the public domain, but it is really helpful in kind of visualizing these examples because in previous semesters, like what I've done is bring in outside guests to talk about how they use criterion reference testing. That's what I've done in the past. Unfortunately, with the COVID, this is the best I can do. And so, although this video is ancient, it's helpful. So just let me emphasize, it is helpful because it provides multiple examples, like visual examples of tests being used. So it's not just me in my zebra jacket here telling you, yeah, we can use it in dojos. I'm here to tell you that it's helpful to other people too. So yeah, I'm gonna roll credits, or not credits, I'm gonna roll the film in a second. So I'll see you later. Bye.
In some respects, life is a series of tests and competitive events. Sometimes we compete against one another, while other situations require us to meet specific predetermined standards. Now, this distinction is also true of the instructional setting. For many years, our measurement programs have required students to compete against one another. When their test scores are placed on a graph, the usual result is a bell-shaped curve. A few students fail, and about the same number make a high grade, but most fall somewhere in between. This concept, known as norm reference testing, dates back to the turn of the century. During World War I, norm reference tests were designed to determine mental and aptitude qualifications of personnel entering military service. Even today, when selections must be based on an individual's relative standing within a group, norm reference tests are used, such as in the Airman Qualifying Examination, which is used to group individuals according to their aptitudes for certain career fields, and the Weighted Airman Promotion System, in which comparative test results are used as a factor in identifying the best qualified individuals from a given group. But when we need assurance that each student can do a specific job, norm reference tests are not adequate. In this film, another in the Instructional Technology series, we will introduce a concept of measurement called criterion reference testing, point out some of the advantages of this concept, and look at examples of how criterion reference tests can be used. In the next few minutes, we will present several educators, each pointing out applications of criterion reference testing. One of these educators is an associate professor of education for the University of California at Los Angeles. He is Dr. Stephen Klein, author and lecturer in tests and measurement. Dr. Klein.
There is an ever-increasing demand in education and training institutions to improve our ability to determine the effectiveness of instructional programs. This demand to make programs more accountable for their outcomes has given rise to focusing attention on what the student has actually learned. We want to know what a student can do as a result of participation in a given course. In order to do this, we must first develop precise instructional objectives. These objectives describe, in behavioral terms, what the student should be able to do by the end of the program, the conditions under which this performance can be expected to occur, and the standard or quality of performance required. The second step in determining whether a program is successful is to find out whether the student has met the objective. To do this, one needs tests that are specifically designed to measure the student's ability to accomplish these objectives. Traditionally, however, our tests have not focused on instructional outcomes, but rather have tried to measure the relative differences between students. These tests are still valuable for such purposes as career guidance and selecting students for college. But if the purpose of the testing is to determine whether an instructional program was successful, in the sense that the students achieved course objectives, then we must use measures that are specifically designed for this purpose. These measures are called criterion reference tests.
I am Joe Sherrod, Coordinator of Communications for the Fort Worth Public School System. Our curriculum makes driver's education available to all high school students who have reached their 15th birthday. The purpose of our program is to produce better driver citizens. Driver education in Fort Worth schools includes classroom instruction, simulator instruction, and on-street driving. During the on-street driving phase, the student demonstrates his ability to perform various maneuvers previously experienced in the simulator phase. For example, one of our behavioral objectives requires the student to safely parallel park an automobile. In this case, we do not accept a verbal or written description of procedures and techniques for parallel parking as evidence that the objective has been achieved. Instead, we expect him to actually parallel park without contacting another car, bumping the curb, or unduly blocking traffic. Through this process, the student demonstrates the performance and behavior specified in the objective. Success in this kind of performance testing activity is one of the best indicators of a student driver's ability to succeed and survive on our streets and highways. And we should not overlook the value of this teaching and testing activity in terms of self-confidence acquired by the student driver.
I'm Captain Sam Page, Manager of Flying Instruction at American Airlines. In our training program, we designed instruction and criterion reference tests to cover precisely what our flight crews need for job performance. We wrote specific behavioral objectives based on these job requirements and the standards for FAA certification. We then translated these objectives into individualized segments of instruction and let our people go through the program at their own pace. To assure that each student is achieving these objectives, progress checks are made as the student proceeds through the instruction for such areas as pneumatic systems, fuel systems, and emergency procedures. In addition, our instruction has been improved through teaching and testing activity in the flight simulator phase, such as the simulated landing we're about to see. Using the kind of simulator you've just seen and frequent progress checks, we have been able to reduce flying training hours, cut total course length, and at the same time improve quality and enhance safety. We know our instructional system works because performance tests administered by both company and FAA check pilots show that flight crews qualify in less aircraft time than ever before. In short, we have enhanced the efficiency and effectiveness of our instruction through criterion reference testing through various phases of training: systems trainer, cockpit procedures trainer, simulator, and finally, the aircraft.
What we have in criterion reference testing is measurement related directly to specific objectives, identifying students who have achieved an objective versus those who have not. It's a go, no-go situation. A student either achieves an objective or he doesn't. If he doesn't, either the instruction isn't doing the job it was intended to do, or the student lacks the aptitude or is not sufficiently motivated to achieve.